Hey everyone, welcome to the Photographer's Lair. Okay, so in this module, we're going to take a deep dive into working with curves adjustments. Curves is such a powerful tool for working with the color and toning of your image. It's out there in various forms in almost any editing software available for video and still images like Photoshop. Just because there's so much flexibility and you can work with it in a number of different ways, it's really cool. Now, I'm going to spend my time here with you in Photoshop, even though this is available in Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw if you use the raw adjustment filters, or Camera Raw filter, whatever. Photoshop has a couple little tricks up its sleeve that help you work with curves for doing some cool stuff when you're doing compositing, and we'll get into that. Now, if you're just a beginner and you're just starting off on this stuff and compositing isn't out there for you yet, you're not quite ready to work in compositing, this will give you some idea of what's possible, but I'm trying to make this accessible and useful information for anybody at any level, so don't let it overwhelm you, but just know that there's some cool stuff. And here we go. So if you go into Photoshop, I'm going to show you how this works with this portrait from one of my earlier Painterly portrait classes. This was early in 2020 before all the COVID stuff went crazy, and anyway, great shot. But a lot of the times, you know, we talk in Photoshop about editing non-destructively, and that's one thing where I recommend always using the adjustment layers versus actually just applying adjustments directly to the image. So if you just apply it directly to the image, you can go up here to Image, Adjustments, and use curves. Now, the basic concept of curves is you have this line that goes diagonally from lower left to upper right, and that's representing the lightness and darkness of your image. And you also have channels. Each of your red, green, and blue channels, you can work on them independently, as well as the overall luminosity of the image. Okay, so basic concept here. If you just click in the middle, it'll add a point, and if you drag that up, it increases the luminosity or brightness of the image. Conversely, if you drag it down, it'll make it darker. Now, what I was saying is, if you just click OK, that actually changes the pixels and fixes that change into your image. So if you save this, you can't get that back. Now, thankfully, in the recent versions of Photoshop, you can undo that. So Control Z. There is a workaround to that, and that's in if you create this image layer as a smart object, you can then go back in and re-edit that, but that's outside of the scope of what we're talking about here. So what I'm going to show you is just working within the concept of the adjustment layers, and there's two ways to create that. You can come down here to the bottom of your layer panel and click on that button and go up to curves like so, and it'll create your curve. Or if you have the adjustments panel open, you can just click on the curves button. It does the exact same thing. Okay, now you'll notice there's a bunch of other little buttons here, and this is one of my favorite ones, especially when you get into compositing. That is called the clipping mask. I'll show you how that works when we get to that portion of this, but right now I want you to focus on how this curve looks and works. The basic overall concept with curves is that you have an input and an output that reflects basically the current state of your image, which is the input, and what adjustment you make with the curves, and that is your output. Now, across the bottom and up the left side of this curve, you'll see a gradient from black to white. So basically what that is saying is that if you go to 100% pure black on your original image, that luminance value is 0. And currently, with the line being a perfectly straight 45-degree angle here, all the input values are the exact same as the output values. In other words, the image hasn't been changed. But if you take this input of pure black, 0, and drag that up. Okay, do it. Yep, you have to click and actually hit that point. As you drag this up, you're basically saying that original value of 0 or pure black, I want to remap to currently right now it's 22, a luminance value of 22. So what is reflected here is the overall luminance values, the range of values you have in any image. It goes from 0 to 255. So 0 is your pure black, 255 is your pure white. So you can see here, if you leave that at its original point, it's 255 on the original image and 255 on the adjustment. Same thing what we did there with black. If you take this white point and drag it down, now we're saying everything that was pure white and the lighter image pixels is now, instead of 255, I want to make that 144. And you can see the overall curve here. So if you click along here, it's adjusting everything in the image so that 189 is now 104. So it's bringing everything down other than where it's leaving the original black point. That's just making that entire image look darker. Now, this specifically is one way that some people, and I've done this before, make images look more like they're shot at nighttime, because in the night, you don't have really bright highlights. Everything's kind of dull and dark and whatever. Just food for thought. So you don't have to get hung up on the minutia of, oh, I want to adjust value, 185 and bring that up to 204. Don't look at it at that technical amount of detail, but you want to have a basic understanding that the original image is represented by the lower axis of this image, whereas the edit or adjustment that you make with this curve tool is represented by the vertical axis on the left. So as you move the curve up or down, your input values are shifting to where you drag those points to on the vertical axis. So to go into a little finer detail with that, if we look specifically at the black point again, one way of giving photos kind of the vintage look or maybe a matte tone finish is bringing that black point up, basically reducing the overall contrast because you don't have the deep solid pure black. But you can then bring down and give it a slight more curve so the rest of the image goes back towards that original line. So that is just a subtle way of bringing up the level of those pure blacks to a bit of a gray tone. And that works really well for a lot of the painterly style images or other images that you might want to be working on. On the other hand, if you want to make the overall image darker in the shadow tones, you can bring that black point over to the right. Now remember, that means then that everything in the image that was a luminance value of 16 and below is now going to be pushed to pure black. And similar to what I did on the other one, you can bring that point so the rest of the image goes back in line with that original curve, so that now we're mainly just darkening down those shadow tones, taking them further into black. With the white point, you can do the same kind of thing. And that really kind of dulls and flattens those kind of specular highlights. I don't necessarily do that kind of edit very much, but that's what you can do with that white point. So along the left side, you have this narrow gradient that shows black at the bottom and white at the top. Same thing here, black on the left, white on the right. And you can see it's overlaid over the histogram of your image. Now, histograms, if you're familiar with them, are just a representation of the amount of image data, lightness and darkness, that goes through from dark to white. dark to light, whatever. So basically this is showing you there's a whole lot of this image down here in the lower section of the image, and there's a little bit up through the highlights here. And this is actually a histogram that I like for a lot of my low key or lower key images. You can see that there's a lot of dark background and some deep shadows in here on her, but there's a good amount of highlights here in her face and shirt and a little bit in her hair. That's where all this information is. So specifically to curves, we're talking about how you can change the lightness and darkness of your image by just adjusting this. And if you don't know where in the image, say you think, okay, well, this looks nice, but I maybe want the highlight on her cheek to be a little bit less. You can use this little finger pointer with the two arrows, click on that, and then you can just click right here on her cheek. And notice on the curve over here, when I'm on the image, it picks and shows on the curve where that section is. If I'm over here in the shadows, it's down in the shadow area on the lower left of that curve. Up here on the highlights, it's up near the upper end. If you just click and hold, you can drag that up and down. So I'll bring that down just a little bit, and you can see it creates this entire curve because you have 3 points. The uppermost point, the lowermost point, and then this one that we just added. Now that took the entire image down, so I can just come back here and bring this back so that the rest of the line pretty much follows that 45-degree diagonal line that we had originally. So that just changes. If I turn that off and on, you can see it's just bringing down those highlight areas of the overall image. Okay, now double click on that to bring that edit back up. You can also use this eyeball here to do the same thing, and you can reset it just by hitting that little back rewind button. Okay, so cool things you can do with that. This is one of the ways that I like to make a day to night conversion, especially if I'm doing composites and I'm working with different backgrounds, because nighttime there aren't highlights unless you have a pin light source, right? It's dark out. There might be some subtle grays and everything else like this, but you're not getting big bright highlights. So bringing this all the way down like that is one way to make an image look like it is nighttime. The other portion to that is typically nighttime has a lot more blue tones in most of the image. So let's do that. Go in here to the blue channel, and we'll just increase the blue in the shadows and a little bit in the midtones. And that's just this nice kind of subtle blue washed dark image. Now, I'm not saying that I would normally edit a portrait like that, but you get the idea. So if we go back to that, but I've left the blue, you can see this creates a cool kind of blue color grade. And that's where you get into the real powerful aspects of this, is working with these color channels. And most of the presets or actions that you might get for Lightroom or Photoshop, any of those that are professionally done, most of the time, if they're doing any kind of color work, there's going to be some adjustments here in curves on the RGB channels. One thing to keep in mind with this, I'm going to reset this. Reset. All the way back to the beginning. RGB also has the converse of the CMYK. So red is the opposite of cyan, green is the opposite of magenta, and blue is the opposite of yellow. So if you're working on the red channel and you increase it, it adds red to the image. If you decrease it, it adds cyan. Okay? Same thing, green, increase it, obviously you get green, but if you decrease it, you get more magenta. Okay? And blue, more yellow. less blue, more yellow. So if you want to do some fun color grading stuff with an image like this, say we want to take the blue up in the shadows like we were doing, and I'm leaving the midpoint here so it doesn't curve the entire thing. Then I go to the greens and I'm going to bring that up a little bit. And then red, I'm going to actually punch a little more red. Now, I don't want to blow it out, so I'm going to just leave it like this. I'm going to add more red into the highlights. And I think I want to do the same thing with yellow, so I'll bring blue out of the highlights like so. So now there's this kind of cinematic looking, and it's probably a little stronger than I would like for an actual cinematic color grade here, but I wanted to show you the effect. And you can just bring that down a little bit like that. So there's before and after with those curves adjustments. Okay, cool. I hope that all makes sense. And there's lots of, different presets that you can get in here. Strong contrast. And that's where the classic S curve that people talk about comes from, is if you bring the shadows down and the highlights up, creating this subtle S curve, that increases the contrast of the image. That's what contrast is. It's separation and increasing the amount of difference between your highlights and shadows. Lighter, that's just overall, yeah. These are basic little preset curves. And conversely, if you want to reduce contrast, you can bring the shadows up and the highlights down, and that kind of flattens the image out more. All depends on what you want to do. If you want to get in and just do a quick edit, if you use auto for a curve, it depends on the image. It will analyze it and do its best guess at making something look nice. So this pretty much just did a subtle increase in the overall highlight area of the image. So that's what auto did on this one. It might not always do that. So, a little preview here for the compositing. If I go over to this image, which is kind of an extreme, funky looking woodsy background, and I create a curves adjustment layer and hit auto, let's see what it does. I have no idea what it's going to do. It just brought it up again. It made it brighter. So auto's fine. You can play with that if you want, but not something that I typically do with curves. So when it comes to composites, one of the most challenging aspects that you'll run into is blending images or different elements together realistically, because the color tones may be different. The contrast is going to be different. The color balance is going to be different. So I want to show you some cool tricks with curves to work with that. So I've got this image of my wife with a longsword, samurai longsword here. And this is from an old shoot that we did in the steampunk theme quite a while back. Anyway, you can see that it's not really great as far as fitting in with this background scene. Now, this curves trick isn't always going to be absolutely, perfect done, and you don't have to do anything else to get it to blend, but this gets you a really good start at matching the color tones and contrast of the background image that you're working with. So if we select our subject layer and create a curves adjustment above that, you remember I mentioned this little clipping mask button. If you click on that, you can see it gets this drop down arrow right here. And that means that now this curves adjustment will impact only your subject layer and not the overall image. So if we just do like that without that clipping mask on there and bring it up, you can see it's affecting the entire image, both our subject model and the background, which is not what we want. If you create that clipping mask, and another way to do it, hold down the Alt key on a PC or Option on a Mac, and if you hover between those layers, you get that little drop down box icon, and click, it will do the same thing. Okay, so now this adjustment will only affect our subject. One more little thing we need to make sure we do here is to select the actual curve icon in that layer. It defaults to selecting the mask, which we don't want to work on. We want to work on the actual curve adjustment. Now, I didn't mention it previously, but you have these three eyedroppers here. This top one that has a black tip is black point. This is the mid gray point, and then your highlight point. To get it to match the background fairly closely, you need to double click on each of these separately. So we'll go to the black one first, double click, and it brings up your color picker. You want to make sure your sample is either all layers or current layer and below. Just make sure it's not just current layer, because then it will be picking on the layer of your adjustment. So I usually just leave it at all layers. And I want to come over into one of the darkest areas around our subject. Now, I say around the subject because depending on the image you're working with, you might have a variation in the overall contrast, like up close. If you're working on an image that's got a lot of haze to it, like the background of the far distance of the scene goes off into a hazy gray. If you pick back there, it's all just going to be gray. You want to pick where the subject is. Anyway, pick the dark point of where your subject is, click OK. And it comes up this save the new target colors as defaults. Now, I usually just hit no on this. You can say yes, but basically what that's going to do is if you load up and go back to your presets and say go back to default, it will go back to those colors. So I don't really want to do that most of the time. Okay, so pick a midpoint. Now on this, I want to be careful because if you just go, okay, like middle up in here, it's going to be very green and you're going to turn your model's skin green. So I don't want something so green that it does that. I'm going to see, yeah, so up here in this tree, this area has a nice kind of gray with just a hint of green, which I think will work. And again, no, I don't want to save that. And pick a white point. Now, same thing here. I don't really want the absolute brightest point here because she's not actually emanating that light. She's reflecting light. So I'm going to come over here to, and I didn't, if you saw, I changed her. I didn't double click. I want to double click and then pick that point. Okay. Now you go back through them and only single click and then pick the black point on her. And you might need to mess around with that because depending on the image and how you think it looks, you may or may not want the actual absolute blackest point. So what it's doing is it's mapping where you pick to the color that you loaded into it with the picker the first time we went through this. So now go to the midpoint, mid-tones, and I'm going to go somewhere around there, highlight, and pick there. Nah, that's too much. So something like that, and I think I might have picked actually too bright of a white point for the original one, which that's okay. What we can do, remember what I showed you previously, if you come over here to the upper right and just drag that down, we can change how this curve looks to get it to match a little bit closer what we actually want. So I'm just bringing those highlights back down a little bit so that it looks more natural in my mind to what we had. So right there, we've got a pretty good start at blending her into this scene. Now, of course, I would spend more time actually adding in shadows and cleaning up some of these edges where it's glowing and it probably shouldn't be, and the hair and all that other kind of thing to really clean up and make this a much stronger composite. But as far as matching her to the tone and contrast of that background, that's a great start. Maybe just a hint of reducing that black point too. So what I did was take the black point up so it's not complete solid black, because right through here I don't think we are. Anyway, there's that. So I'm going to turn that off and show you basically blending the same image onto this scene, which is an underpass in downtown Indianapolis. Meridian Street, if anybody's familiar with that. Anyway, same concept. Create our curves adjustment. I'm going to go a little bit quicker this time. Make sure that curve icon is selected. Create the clipping mask. Now I'm just going to double click on that. Come over here, get a dark black. Okay. No. Midpoint. And midpoint, I'm probably going to go with this gray, yellow, orange on the back wall. Okay. And highlight. Now again, this scene's a little bit tricky because you have this bright light up here, but it's got kind of a extra yellow, almost green yellow tint to it. I don't want that. I'm going to pick the highlight over here on the upper beam, because I think it actually matches most of the scene better. And click OK. And now we'll go back through that process. Click once, click on her, midpoint, click on her, highlight, and pick her. So there is that. And same thing, I think overall, I'm going to drop it down just a little more, like so. And really quickly, I think that matches really well with that overall scene. Again, as I mentioned, by no means am I done with that composite. Actually, I think I might finish this one off and show you guys, just as a little treat, the speed edit of completing this composite image as it is. So you can see where I would normally go from here with an image like this. Okay. Outside of that, let me know if you guys have any questions. Like I said, curves are awesome for tweaking colors and everything in your image. Members of the Patreon are actually going to get some of these files to work along with. And if you sign up for my compositing class, which I'm not 100% sure when that's going to launch, but I'm going to put together a compositing class online course, these will also be available in that, along with the complete walkthrough of how I finish this off as a composite image. So you'll get the entire process as well as sample files. So finishing everything off from this point, as well as doing the initial selection and everything that it takes to build this composite out, including the actual files. I'll give you the files to work with. You can work along with me, and then share those back into the Photographer's Lair group for any feedback, or send me them directly if you would like. It's up to you how you want to work that, but either in the Patreon group or in my compositing class, you can get access to this stuff and see a whole lot more. Thanks. Have a great day.